March 13, 1938, Moscow, House of the Unions.
The third Moscow show trial regarding the Trotskyite conspiracy came to an end. The defendants were prominent Bolshevik party leaders representing the so-called right opposition. Among the primary defendants were Lenin's close associates, Nikolai Bukharin, the party's former chief ideologist, and Alexei Rykov, the former head of the Soviet government. The third key defendant was the former head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, Genrikh Yagoda. It was he who had fine-tuned the machinery of mass repression and created the terrible Gulag system of forced labor camps in which millions of Soviet citizens perished. As head of the unified NKVD, Yagoda was one of the most powerful men in the country, feared even by many members of the Politburo. At Stalin's behest, Yagoda carried out covert assassinations and fabricated high-profile political trials against the opposition and Stalin's rivals. Now, by a cruel twist of fate, Yagoda himself sat in the dock, accused of high treason, conspiracy, and espionage. The verdict was entirely expected. 18 of the 21 defendants were sentenced to death by firing squad, including Yagoda. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, all the convicts in this case were rehabilitated, except for Genrikh Yagoda. How did an ordinary bureaucrat who had achieved nothing before the revolution and lacked even a high school education climb to the very pinnacle of power? And why did Stalin decide to get rid of his obedient executioner? Genrikh Yagoda was born in 1891 in Rybinsk to a Jewish family. In the Russian Empire of that era, those who practiced Judaism, who were predominantly ethnic Jews, faced severe restrictions. They were required to live exclusively within the Pale of Settlement, a designated territory in the western part of the empire, in small, semi-urban settlements known as shtetls. Adherents of the Jewish faith were barred from entering many major cities, could not own agricultural land, and were prohibited from holding government positions. If a person of the Jewish faith converted to Russian Orthodoxy, all restrictions were lifted. Such people were colloquially referred to as vikrests. Indeed, Vladimir Lenin's maternal grandfather, Israel Blank, was a baptized Jew. In 1912, the young Genrikh Yagoda was detained by police in Moscow for illegally traveling outside the Pale of Settlement. A court sentenced him to 2 years of exile in Simbirsk, where he lived with his grandfather, a watchmaker. However, in the spring of 1913, an amnesty was declared to mark the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. Yagoda's sentence was reduced, and he moved to St. Petersburg, securing a job in the cashier's office of the country's largest industrial plant, the Putilov plant. To gain the legal right to live in the capital, Genrikh was forced to convert. It was then that he changed his Jewish name to the Germanic Genrikh. In 1915, at the height of the First World War, Genrikh Yagoda was drafted into the army. He served on the front lines, rising to the rank of corporal, but was wounded in the autumn of 1916. Following his discharge, he returned to Petrograd. Yagoda owed his rapid post-revolutionary rise entirely to family connections. His father, Gershon Yagoda, was a cousin of Yakov Sverdlov's father. Yakov would go on to become one of the key Bolshevik leaders and the formal head of the Soviet state. Yagoda's father and Yakov Sverdlov's father both worked as engravers in Nizhny Novgorod. While they owned legitimate workshops, their primary business was forging false identity documents for revolutionaries and criminals. Later, Gershon Yagoda's home even housed a clandestine Bolshevik printing press. This allowed Genrikh to later claim he had been aiding the revolutionary cause since childhood. However, Stalin's personal secretary, Boris Bajanov, who knew Yagoda personally, offered a much less heroic account of his youth.
Sverdlov's father took Yagoda in as an apprentice. Twice, Genrikh robbed his master, stealing tools and materials to open his own competing workshop. Both times he failed and returned to Sverdlov's father with his head bowed. he was forgiven because they were relatives.
It was in the Sverdlov home that Yagoda met Edda Averbach, the young niece of Yakov Sverdlov. She was 14 years younger than Genrikh. Legend has it they married in 1915, but this is highly unlikely, as the bride would have been only 9 years old. It is far more probable they began living together after the revolution, during the Civil War. His marriage to the niece of the powerful Yakov Sverdlov served as Yagoda's primary career springboard, as he possessed no real pre-revolutionary credentials. Later, in his official autobiography, Yagoda claimed he had joined the Bolshevik Party in 1907 and was exiled by the Tsarist regime in 1911. This was a complete lie. In 1930, Yagoda's deputy, an influential Chekist named Mayor Trilisser, attempted to undermine his superior by launching a private investigation into Yagoda's background. He discovered that before the revolution, Yagoda had been an anarchist rather than a Bolshevik, only joining the party in the summer of 1917. However, Stalin chose to ignore this. He backed the loyal Yagoda, while the overzealous Trilisser was dismissed from the OGPU secret police. In 1918, Yakov Sverdlov became the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, a position that made him the formal head of the Soviet state. In terms of political influence, he was the third most powerful man in the country, behind only Lenin and Trotsky. This was followed by the rapid rise of Yagoda, whom Trotsky sarcastically dubbed a diligent non-entity. An obscure young man who worked as a clerk for the newspaper Derivenskaya Bednota, the rural poor, he made several extraordinary leaps in just a single year. First, he joined the apparatus of the Petrograd Cheka, the early Soviet secret police, which carried out political surveillance, hunted down counter-revolutionaries, and executed dissidents. Just a few months later, he was appointed to the Supreme Military Inspection of the Red Army, immediately securing the position of deputy chairman. From there, he joined the Collegium of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade, the Soviet Trade Ministry, and finally became the administrative director of the Special Department of the Cheka. Yagoda immediately took a leadership position in this crucial department of the Cheka. By 1920, he had joined the Presidium of the Cheka, the supreme governing body of the secret police. In effectively just 2 years, Yagoda was transformed from a newspaper clerk into one of the top leaders of the Cheka. By this point, Yakov Sverdlov had already died under mysterious circumstances. Therefore, Yagoda's continued career ascent could no longer be explained solely by his relation to the influential Bolshevik. He did, however, possess a talent of a certain kind. Yagoda mastered the political intrigues that facilitated career advancement, undermining superiors, pitting rivals against one another, and other dirty bureaucratic games. While still an inspector with the Red Army, he traveled to the front lines, met nearly all the prominent Bolsheviks, and, through his phenomenal sycophancy and obsequiousness, quickly secured their favor. Even during Lenin's lifetime, Yagoda worked his way up to become the second deputy to the founder of the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky. In 1926, following Dzerzhinsky's death, he became the first deputy to the new head of the OGPU, the successor to the Cheka, Vyacheslav Menjinsky, who was already gravely ill by then. In addition, Yagoda took charge of the key secret operational department of the OGPU, which was responsible for combating all internal political opponents of the party. It was during this period that Yagoda grew close to Stalin, who, in his struggle for power within the party, sought allies among the Chekists. Yagoda backed Stalin in his clash with Trotsky and Zinoviev. Given the nature of his position, Yagoda was responsible for neutralizing political opposition, and in this role, he proved highly useful to Stalin. It was largely thanks to Yagoda that first Trotsky's supporters and later Zinoviev's were crushed. In 1929, Stalin decided to utilize prison labor for the country's rapid industrialization. The implementation of this project was entrusted to the OGPU secret police. Formally, The agency was headed until 1934 by the gravely ill Vyacheslav Menjinsky, but in practice, all of the work was directed by his first deputy, Genrikh Yagoda. Concentration camps existed in Soviet Russia even before the Gulag, but they were relatively small and played no role in the economy. It was Yagoda who transformed them into a giant economic trust powered by slave labor. In 1930, the Chief Administration of Camps, abbreviated as the Gulag, was established. Yagoda directly supervised this process and appointed the first heads of the Gulag, such as Lazar Kogan and Matvey Berman. Yagoda developed a system of so-called self-sustaining camps. From then on, the primary task of the Gulag was not the isolation of criminals, but the fulfillment of the targets of Stalin's 5-year plans. The labor of prisoners became a free resource for some of the most grueling and lethal construction projects in history. It was Yagoda who oversaw the Gulag's first major project, the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, often called the Belomor Canal, where tens of thousands of people perished from grueling labor, cold, and starvation. Yagoda personally visited the canal to inspect the work, and for the successful completion of the construction, he received the Order of Lenin, the Soviet Union's highest state decoration. In 1938, when Yagoda was executed, the camps of the Gulag he created held up to 2 million people. With the onset of industrialization, the standard of living in Soviet cities plummeted. To prevent mass protests, the anger of hungry workers was masterfully redirected toward the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia, with engineers accused of sabotage. This phenomenon became known as specialist baiting, the systematic persecution and elimination of pre-revolutionary bourgeois experts. It reached its peak in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Under Yagoda's supervision, several major show trials of so-called saboteurs were fabricated, notably the Shakti trial and the Industrial Party trial. In essence, these show trials served as a dress rehearsal for the Great Terror of 1937. Special mention must be made of the repressions against the Voinspetsy, former Tsarist officers and generals who had defected to the Bolsheviks. It was thanks to the experience of these very military professionals that the Red Army secured victory in the Civil War. In the early 1930s, the OGPU initiated Case Vesna, or Spring, targeting these military specialists. According to some reports, more than 3,000 people were arrested, including senior commanders and instructors at the Military Academy of the Red Army. In Leningrad alone, over 1,000 people were executed in this case. Yagoda personally supervised Case Vesna and blew its scale up to catastrophic proportions. Within the party, Genrikh Yagoda was hated and despised. In his lifestyle, he was nothing like a dedicated communist. Yagoda loved living lavishly, indulging in wild revelry, and was notoriously weak when it came to women. When Yagoda was arrested and his home was searched, investigators discovered, in addition to vast sums of money, a staggering quantity of luxury goods. The resulting inventory listed 130 items, including
imported 40-year-old vintage wines, 1,229 bottles, explicit photographs, 3,904 items, explicit films, 11 items, imported cigarettes, Egyptian and Turkish, over 11,000, imported men's coats, 21 items, imported men's suits, 22 items, an artificial intimate device, 1 item, antique tableware, over 1,000 pieces, other antique objects, 270 items.
Today, such a list might seem modest, but in the 1930s, when Soviet cities survived on ration cards and a deadly famine ravaged the countryside, this inventory represented unimaginable wealth. The average Soviet citizen owned, at best, a couple of worn-out garments. Against this backdrop, Yagoda's 22 imported suits were the equivalent of a fleet of supercars today. Yet, the greatest shock was caused neither by the luxury goods nor the intimate devices. This confiscation shattered the sacred myth of the ascetic Bolshevik, who sacrifices himself for the cause, wears a simple military greatcoat, and works 12 hours a day. The reality was sordid. Behind the facade of equality lay rampant corruption, sexual degeneracy, and outright theft. However, the hatred for Yagoda within the party was driven by more than his craving for luxury, revelry, and his complete lack of interest in Marxist ideology. Yagoda was despised as a spy. All major figures of the nomenklatura, the Soviet ruling elite, knew perfectly well that one of Yagoda's primary functions was to spy on them and report to Stalin regarding their loyalty. In many people's commissariats, the Soviet ministries, it became standard practice to appoint a man from the OGPU Secret Service as a deputy commissar, in other words, a deputy minister. The commissars knew all too well that these Chekists, who had no expertise in their department's work, were placed there solely to monitor them and report their every move directly to Yagoda. Another reason for the universal contempt toward Yagoda was his lack of real revolutionary credentials. The Soviet elite, which at that time still consisted of dedicated revolutionaries, could not accept that absolute power over them had been handed to an opportunistic non-entity, a man who had counted loose change in a pharmacy register while they languished in the underground or rotted in czarist penal servitude. In 1934, following the death of Vyacheslav Menjinsky, Genrikh Yagoda finally became the absolute and sole chief of the Soviet secret services. During this same period, a pivotal reform took place. The OGPU was reorganized into the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the legendary NKVD. Yagoda became the first People's Commissar, or minister, of this newly unified agency, which brought the police, border guards, the Gulag camp system, and state security under a single command. Yet this pinnacle of power, paradoxically, marked the beginning of the end of his career. In December 1934, an event occurred in Leningrad that shocked the entire country. Sergei Kirov, the leader of the Leningrad Party organization and a close friend of Stalin, was assassinated. Although the lone gunman acted independently, Yagoda quickly sized up the situation. Seeking to please the Soviet leader, he artificially inflated the case, fabricating an entire counter-revolutionary group out of the killer's friends and casual acquaintances. But Stalin remained unsatisfied. The scale of the conspiracy seemed too minor to him. Kirov's assassination was the perfect pretext to finally destroy Grigory Zinoviev, who by then had long been removed from power. Since Zinoviev had been the absolute master of Leningrad 10 years prior, Stalin demanded that he be linked to Kirov's murder. The official narrative was to be framed as follows. Zinoviev, refusing to accept his defeat, had orchestrated the assassination of the party favorite through his loyalists in Leningrad. However, Yagoda made a fatal mistake. He allowed himself to ignore the Soviet leader's hint and even expressed doubt regarding this theory. Grigory Zinoviev and his associate, Lev Kamenev, were arrested, but during the first trial, they admitted only to moral responsibility for what had happened. For Stalin, this was not enough. Yagoda himself considered his task complete. For a time, Stalin pretended to agree with him, even awarding Yagoda the new title of General Commissioner of State Security, a rank equivalent to a military marshal. But behind the scenes, the Soviet leader was already searching for Yagoda's replacement. Soon, a successor was found, Nikolai Yezhov, an obscure party bureaucrat who had proven himself to be a fanatical and absolutely obedient executor of Stalin's will during recent party purges. Just a few months later, a new case was opened against Zinoviev and Kamenev, who were already in prison. Although Yagoda formally remained the head of the investigation, Stalin appointed Yezhov as the actual director of the process, granting him carte blanche, unlimited authority, and precise instructions on what confessions to extract from the defendants. Yezhov steered the investigation in the desired direction, and Stalin was completely satisfied with his work. Against this backdrop, Yagoda, in the eyes of the Soviet leader, had grown complacent and began to exhibit a dangerous, rotten liberalism. He was unwilling to undertake a truly bloody purge of the party elite. Yezhov, who understood hints instantly, and was ready to commit any atrocity for his career, contrasted sharply with Yagoda, who over his years at the helm of the secret services had transformed into an independent and therefore dangerous figure to Stalin. The former People's Commissar was no longer needed. In August 1936, the first high-profile show trial of Zinoviev and Kamenev took place, ending in their execution. Exactly 1 month later, Genrikh Yagoda was removed from his post. This was done in a highly unusual manner. Stalin had gone on vacation to Sochi with his close associate, Andrei Zhdanov, where they discussed the dismissal of the commissar. Afterward, a famous encrypted telegram was dispatched to Moscow.
We consider it absolutely necessary and urgent to appoint Comrade Yazhov to the post of People's Commissar of Internal Affairs. Yagoda has clearly proven unequal to the task of exposing the Trotsky-Zinoviev bloc.
Formally, Yagoda was removed by a decision of the Politburo. However, no formal meeting was ever held on the matter. Lazar Kaganovich, who loathed Yagoda, quickly drafted the resolution upon receiving the telegram from Sochi. By circular vote, without holding a formal meeting, simply by calling members of the Politburo, he secured their consent and forwarded the document to the Sovnarkom, the Soviet government, where it was immediately signed by Vyacheslav Molotov. The following day, Yagoda learned of his dismissal. It came as a crushing blow. He did not yet understand where this was heading and refused to believe he could be so easily cast down from his pedestal. Within the Politburo, whose members almost unanimously detested Yagoda, they openly gloated over the fallen executioner. Yagoda was reassigned to the humiliating and politically powerless post of People's Commissar of Communications, essentially the Minister of Posts and Telegraphs. In Stalin's system, this was a favored tactic known as a soft landing. Stalin never arrested powerful security chiefs immediately, fearing it might provoke a mutiny among the Chekists loyal to them. Instead, the victim was first transferred to an innocuous civilian post, lulling them into a false sense of security while the successor quietly purged the agency of the old boss's loyalists. Yagoda did not remain in this new position for long. Immediately after his transfer, he was sent on a 2-month leave, and shortly after his return, he was dismissed from his post and expelled from the party. In late March 1937, Yagoda was arrested. The case against him was led by Nikolai Yazhov, a man with a highly twisted imagination. In addition to the standard charges of high treason, plotting a coup, and spying for Germany, Yagoda was accused of poisoning his former chief, Menjinsky, the famous proletarian writer Maxim Gorky, plotting the assassination of Stalin, and even attempting to murder Yazhov himself. According to the investigators' theory, Yagoda had ordered the walls of the new People's Commissar's office to be sprayed with toxic chemicals. On March 13, 1938, Genrikh Yagoda was found guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad. 2 days later, the sentence was carried out at the Kommunarka secret execution ground near Moscow. By Yazhov's personal order, as a final humiliation, the once all-powerful People's Commissar was forced to watch the execution of everyone scheduled to die alongside him in his execution group. Afterward, Yagoda was brutally beaten by the guards and only then finished off with a gunshot to the head.